Well, good evening. Thank you very much indeed for coming out. I've been really looking forward tonight, which might seem like an odd thing to say, but I really have. I believe very profoundly that grief and death are two things that we should talk a lot more about in our society. We're lucky, really, to have two people who know an enormous amount about the subject with us tonight. I would say for better or worse, but I think probably having read a lot about them and heard a lot of what they've got to say, for worse and better, because what I view in both of what they've got to say is quite inspiring stories about how you can face the worst and come out the other side. So what I'm going to ask them first to do is to introduce themselves a little bit, then I'll introduce myself and then we'll get going. Julia, perhaps I can ask you to introduce yourself first.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really, really thrilled to be here, and in a way I'd love to know what the reason was each of you came, what kind of prompted you to spend an important part of your precious evening to be here tonight. So I'd love to ask a few questions and just ask you to put your hand up to have some sense of why you're here before I tell you about me. So if you could put your hand up if you've had a parent die. That's a lot. And if you've had a partner die. That's still a significant number. And a sibling die. And a child die. So a lot of you are here for very personal reasons, which gives it even more meaning. And actually seeing all those hands and knowing some of the people here kind of brings me in goosebumps. But to tell you a bit about me, I'm a psychotherapist. I've been a therapist for about 27 years. I worked for 23 years in the NHS at St Mary's Paddington, supporting families when a child died and when babies died. And from the early years of that, I helped establish and launch Child Bereavement UK. We've got our CEO, Anne, here, and I'm founder patron. And that's an organisation that Bruno is a patron of, and that supports families when a child dies or when a child is bereaved. And from all those layers of experience, from the hundreds of families that I've seen and worked with and the teaching that I've done, I, in a way, got angrier and angrier that something that is such an inevitable part of life is something that is so unvoiced, and people are so ignorant that they come to me with a perfectly normal grief saying, you know, I think I'm going mad, or there's something wrong with me because my husband died 4 months ago and I'm not coping. And so I wrote this book, Grief Works, which came out this year, with lots of different stories of different people's experience of loss, to show that every loss is unique, but at the same time, there are universal norms about grief, which I hope through telling stories which are much more personal, people have a way of understanding themselves. And I hope through our conversations tonight that we will kind of extract some of those understandings.
Well, my cousin gave me Grief Works this summer, and if you haven't read it, I would urge you. It's a fascinating read on every level, incredibly insightful and indeed very moving. Now, there are a few stories more dramatic than Victoria's, both for its tragedy and for its recovery.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Victoria Milligan. I'm sure lots of you know my story, but 4.5 years ago, I was down in Cornwall with my family, my husband Nico, and 4 children, Amber, Olivia, Emily and Kit. And we were doing what we always did, had a beautiful bank holiday weekend down there. Weather was beautiful, and nobody could predict the tragedy that was going to happen on that Sunday afternoon, where our speedboat went out of control and went round and round in the Camel Estuary in very fast, very tight turns and hit each of us in the water. My husband was killed, and my 8-year-old daughter Emily was killed. And I was holding Kit at the time because he was shouting, "No more cold water, Mummy, no more cold water." And I grabbed him and tried to swim away from the circle of the boat towards the beach, not realising how hard it is to swim in a life jacket, of course. And as I turned to see where the boat was, it came and hit me in the chest. But what I didn't feel was the propeller cut my leg, and unfortunately Kit's leg as well. I didn't realise at the time that Emily had died. I knew that Nico had died because my daughter had seen him. We were rescued by RNLI and RAF, taken to Derriford Hospital, and that evening I begged the poor surgeon to save my leg because I knew I was a single mother, and I'd just been told that my 8-year-old daughter had died as well in the accident. There was nothing he could do, so that night my leg was operated on. I woke up the next morning to a room full of family and friends, quite shocked that everyone was there because the complete devastation of the tragedy just hadn't sunk in at all. And it's been a very long recovery since. I suddenly had a whole new world of identities. You know, I'd lost who I was, a happily married mother of 4, and had gained widow, amputee, single parent, and bereaved parent, all in 2 minutes. Luckily, Kit's leg was saved, and that was incredible. We went to St Mary's, and that's where I met the incredible Julia, who came to see me in my room, and I swiftly dismissed her. I said, all I want is Nico and Emily back, and if you can't do that, then I don't want to speak to anybody, so please leave. Quite rude, actually, wasn't I? Yeah.
It was definitely allowed at this point.
I obviously realised as time went on, as my children were asking me quite difficult and emotional questions, that even if I didn't need help, which obviously I did, my children did, and I needed to be able to answer their questions of who's going to walk me down the aisle now in a very sort of selfish way, and did Daddy feel pain when he died, and how did Emily die, and is Daddy still at the bottom of the ocean, and will I ever stop crying, and things like that. So Julia was incredible throughout my recovery and helping me realise how important grief is and how important it is to feel the emotions. And there's no quick little door. I mean, God knows I looked for it. Little door through to the other side and everything will be fine again. There isn't. You have to work through the emotions step by step by step and just be brave enough to feel what you're feeling. And I literally thought I would melt into the floor as a kind of grief puddle, but actually you don't, and it hits you and it pulls away and it gives you a chance to recover. And it's been an incredible journey, and Julia's held my hand the whole way along, and what she doesn't know about grief isn't really worth knowing.
Well, can everyone hear? Are you all right?
Well, thank you both very much for that. Not that it's necessarily that germane to this discussion, but let me tell you a little bit about me. I'm the presenter of News at 10. I've been with ITN for nearly 30 years, which seems like a very, very long time. It is a very, very long time. All that time, I've been sort of increasingly conscious that I spend my life reporting on people who've had things happen that they never believed would happen to them. And all that time, I've equally noticed how people like to push death away. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to think about grief. It's almost as if if we don't think about it, it lessens the chance that something terrible will happen to us. I've sort of, in my own personal journey, perhaps like many of us, come and gone a little bit with that. About halfway through my career, I was a foreign correspondent, which is mostly 5-star tourism at someone else's expense, but occasionally you're called upon to do something that is noticeably quite dangerous. You go to a war zone or whatever. I had very young children at the time, and suddenly there it was, right in my face. What was I doing here? Particularly as a foreign correspondent, you're often judging things. Well, we could go into that village, we'd get an amazing scoop. On the other hand, we could get killed. Well, let's just chat about that for a bit, shall we? And you just go this way and that. And the longer I did it, the more I just sat there thinking, I am in the wrong place. I do not want to die now. I want to stay alive for my kids. That feels like my primary responsibility. And then about halfway through the process of this thought process, if you like, I did actually get shot in a riot in the leg, and I was quite badly injured. And I had two responses for that, which were interesting, I suppose, psychologically. One was elation. I got shot and survived. I'm invincible. And I sort of remember genuinely thinking that, well, I can survive anything now. But at the same time, the whole notion I'd put in my head that I can do this job safely and I can take sensible decisions and I can't take undue risks kind of got blown apart. And actually, to cut a long story short, I decided not to do that anymore and to come away from being a foreign correspondent deliberately. So I suppose I pushed death back again a bit, thought about it as little as I possibly could, until my parents died. And in brief, I was an only child. I was very close to my parents, particularly my mother. And I don't know what I thought, but I thought I'd be okay with it. But all I can say is that I really, really wasn't. And as time went on, I was kind of aware of how incredibly badly I was dealing with it. And I will talk about grief in a moment, but for me it was a bit like a river going into all kinds of places and manifesting itself in all kinds of ways that I didn't even necessarily recognize and didn't understand. And I did go and see a grief counsellor, and she was brilliant at beginning to make sense of it for me and why I was responding in this way. But I had this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be responding in this way. Parents get old, they die, that's what happens. And at the end of all that, I found myself even more as I sit there in my day job thinking about life and death. And I suppose I have reached a bit of a conclusion, which is on the agony of being a human being. We've been blessed with enough intelligence to understand an awful lot about how we ended up where we are. We still can't answer definitively the question why. And I think that just eats away at us and eats away at us. And if you look at the history of human activity, a vast amount of it is about answering that question. It's what a lot of religion is about. If you're very religious, I take my hat off to you, that's a huge comfort. If you're not, it's clearly a more difficult question. But for me, an awful lot, as I look around, as I read this stuff out every day, an awful lot about our society is about avoiding that question because we don't have an answer, not talking about death, not talking about grief. So it's a great privilege for me to have a chance to talk to people who know so much about it and have been through so much. But maybe I can begin with that philosophical question. Julia, perhaps I can start with you. Do you think that we don't talk enough about death as a whole?
I think there is, as you say, a kind of magical thinking that if I don't talk about it, if I don't think about it, then it's not going to happen. And I think we just sort of push it, as you say, push it away until you have an experience like your parents where you then can't not know anymore. Or with the shooting, you know, once you know that you can nearly die and that you are actually mortal, you have both the survival hooray, but also you know that a couple, a foot further either way you can die. And then I think once you've really been bereaved of someone you love, you can't not know that you're going to die or someone you love that can die. But no, I think what's difficult is that we don't know how to talk about it. Because, as you say, people want to be able to fix it. We want to be powerful. We want to make a difference. And you can't fix grief. You can't fix death. And the only thing that works is, the biggest thing that helps is connection to others. That when love dies, it's the love and connection to others that supports us. And for some people that would be lots of people, for others it would be just one or two people. But people who come close to us, when you're grieving, you give off these signals of pain which are transmitted to the people around us. And that scares them because they feel it and it's hard to sit with. And they can't then say anything that's going to make it better. But actually, the key is listening to someone. Let someone say nothing or let someone be sad. And it's the ignorance, because grief feels like fear and the death is unknown. So the two things we most want to kind of have answers to, we can't.
Can I ask you, Victoria, it's an odd question perhaps, but before the tragedy that afflicted you hit, had you ever thought about death much? Was it something that you yourself are conscious of having pushed back?
The only death I'd experienced was that of my father. So he died 2 weeks after I got married. So it was a very sudden death again, and a reasonably young man, but again, your parent, it's the normal course of life. But I do very much remember wondering how I dealt with it, because on one hand I was incredibly happy, I just got married, just got back from my honeymoon, and then my father had just died. So I very much remember thinking, I'm just going to park that because I don't know how to deal with it, because there's too much of a juxtaposition between those two emotions. So I'll deal with it when I'm ready to deal with it, and very much kind of brushed it to one side until my daughter had one of these ridiculous teddies that you'd press and it would go, hello mummy, hello daddy, hello granddad, and she went, mummy, who's granddad? And I literally felt this incredible physical reaction and almost of collapse on the floor, that I hadn't really thought about him and I hadn't honoured the love I had for him with the emotion of grieving for him. And then obviously that delayed grief is horrendous when it comes out, because you've blocked that pain for such a long time that it's very, very almost quite physical pain when it does come out. So that was my own real experience of kind of grief. But I think what is interesting is we're very unprepared in this day and age. If we look back to the way that Victorians dealt with grief, they used to pay into a kind of grief fund or a funeral fund, and they're almost kind of aware of their own mortality while they're still alive, because they're preparing for death and preparing for the end. And in our sort of day and age of perfection and wanting more and more and more, we don't want to face the pain of the end. It's always trying to be joyous and happy and looking forward. And also, I do think they had it right in terms of ever having their roles. So after death, everyone would kind of know what they would do. You know, someone would kind of sit with the body, everyone had a chance to sit with the body and say properly goodbye, but there was a very defined role of what you did after death. And nowadays, you know, when people come around to me, no one knew what to say, no one knew what to do. There's no defined roles anymore in kind of grief, and I think people are sort of floundering a little bit. And it's very difficult. I mean, I wouldn't have known what to say to me, so I'm not saying it's easy, but as Julia says, just say something. You know, you're not going to make them feel any worse than they are. Just face it and don't hide away from it.
Can I just start with you with the shock? We all hope, I think some people in this room have had clearly similar experiences. Everyone who hasn't is clearly hoping that they never have to face it, but we all have to accept that we might.
Yeah.
Can you just talk me through a little? I mean, grief, you've written very eloquently about it in all kinds of ways, but grief ebbs and flows. It's not a constant. Can you just talk us a little bit through, and then I'll ask Julia to pick up from that first moment, the sort of shock, the trauma, and what those first 3 to 6 months were like?
I mean, I do sometimes think, gosh, what would have happened if I hadn't been in hospital and lost my leg as well? Because I remember, reading saying grief at the beginning, you should treat yourself like you're in intensive care. Well, I actually was in intensive care, and I was on morphine, but it slightly feels like you are on morphine for quite a while, because the adrenaline is pumped into your body, and it stops you, luckily, feeling. You're almost covered in this kind of blanket of sort of naivety almost, and then obviously that slowly starts to wear away, and you get little stabs of waking up and thinking, oh my God, this has actually really happened, and then I'll just go back into my shock for a little bit. So that's that period. I mean, for me, I'd say probably lasted a good kind of month or so, and maybe, you know, in shock probably for about a year, because your brain has got to work towards acceptance that this has happened. And Julia knows it was very difficult for me to accept what had happened, because it was such a bizarre, out of the blue, sudden and dramatic loss and tragedy. And I would wake up in the middle of the night with the boat going round and round and round in my head, and just shouting at Nico or myself to do something about it, and not do that and not do that, still trying to prevent it happening. And having spoken to a lot of people about it afterwards, it's not just, you know, even if someone gets cancer, the partner will think, well, I should have sent them to the doctor sooner. We blame ourselves for the loss, and it took me a long time to accept it was just an accident and it's not my fault, because you living with that loss and the guilt is too much.
Can I pick up on that in a moment? But just can I ask you, how common in all the people you've talked to is this kind of unwillingness almost to accept it?
In a way, I think it's because we're amazingly well designed as human beings, that kind of numbness that we feel at the beginning is there for a reason, because if psychologically you knew that both Emily and Nico had died fully, you couldn't probably have computed it. You probably couldn't have survived. So that numbness that we have at the beginning is our natural protection process. But pain is the agent of change, and pain is the thing that forces us to adjust to this new reality. And it hits us bodily, like when with your father dying. And it's when we allow it to come through our systems and allow it to do what it needs to do for us. And for some people it would be crying, some people it would be talking, others it might be writing, or, you know, how people express grief is very individual. But they need to let that work through their system. The difference between a sudden unexpected death is that one way of talking about it is that it's grief with the volume turned up, that it's much more intense. So it has all the qualities of grief, which is feeling guilty, ruminating, going over and over in your mind. But also with you had PTSD, so you had the flashing, recurring images that kind of interfered with you, interfered with your processing. And in a way, with sudden death, and if you're present at it, you can't have a kind of normal, you know, processing. process of grieving until you've dealt with the trauma.
Can I just ask you both to just for a moment talk a little bit more about the physicality of it, because you've both mentioned that, but it's also something I've heard a lot with grief, that people have this enormous physical reaction and it then goes on and affects them in lots of different ways. What is, I mean, is that the adrenaline simply in your body? What is causing that?
I mean, grief is embodied, so we know that every thought that we have has a physiological connection, and in the same way the physiological feeling generates a thought. So our mind and bodies are much more interconnected than I think people fully realize. So when when people are grieving, often they talk about their heart breaking, and actually in the first 3 months of mourning, particularly with men, interestingly, you're more likely to have a heart attack. So your vulnerability to dying is actually higher because your immune system drops. So it's an incredibly physiological, embodied experience. And in a way, it's your body forcing you to recognize this thing that you don't want to recognize. The reality is that the person that you love has died. But if you don't listen to it and you block it, it's the things that you do to block it that probably do you most harm. So people often, the things that I see most commonly people use to anesthetize that physiological pain is busyness, like working very hard, being completely addicted to their smartphones, and sex or drugs or alcohol. So anything that anesthetizes pain. And I think ideally people would like a little smartphone app that they could press and they could do fast track grief and get through it, pay a bit extra, do the prime version and get through it kind of really quickly, and then they can be back to normal.
Well, we're so used to having a manual, aren't we, for kind of everything. And I remember buying so many books on Amazon and just going, right, I'm just going to work through it and almost like I'm doing a course on grief. But, you know, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's so personal. Everyone feels it in completely different ways. And, I mean, the one story I do remember reading is this girl that had lost her brother who had jumped into a river and the water was too shallow, and she remembers saying that her mother then couldn't cope. So she said, not only did I lose my brother that day, but I lost my mother as well. And that, I was so determined when I read that story just to think, wow, I can't do that to my children. I have no choice. I have to survive and I have to get through this.
Well, you obviously, I mean, as you said, actually in intensive care, not just metaphorically in intensive care, but when you look back now, how you responded in that first 6 months to a year. Were you aware of a physicality? Were you aware of trying to block the pain? Can you analyse what was going through your head at the time in retrospect?
No, I can't. I mean, I think the shock obviously lasted for quite a long time for me. And I do remember slightly in a way with my father as well.
Much longer than people expect.
Yeah. Thinking, I just need to get through this bit. So you're almost giving yourself little goals. Because I woke up, you know, on the morning of the 6th of May with a blank diary. Almost with kind of like no life. You know, we're meant to be driving back from Cornwall, taking the kids back to school. Suddenly, everything had completely and utterly changed. And it took a long while to just think, wow, I have kind of no future almost. So at that time, I remember feeling very overwhelmed, but I just had to give myself little goals. The first goal, I had to save Kit's leg. That was just the thing for me, like obviously not me personally, but the amazing surgeons at St Mary's. I just could not bear for him to have lost his leg as well, like me. And then, of course, you do that, and then you think, well, I'll just get to the girls' sports day, and then I can literally just melt into the floor because I'm not going to cope with this, because I was utterly terrified of my grief. I thought, it's too much for anybody to cope with that level of loss, and I'm definitely not brave enough to do it, and I don't want to do it because it's really scary and hideous. And the first waves of grief that I did get were horrendous, but they didn't kill me, and I was almost amazed actually that I sort of survived them. And obviously every time you face that complete pain and lying on Emily's bed hugging her toys and crying her eyes out that you're never going to actually hug her again, it pulls away. And I think once I'd realised that path of grief, I knew that I could do it, that I could be strong enough, that it wasn't going to be easy, it was going to be incredibly painful and incredibly difficult, but I was going to survive it. And that gave me, every time I kind of faced the pain of grief, I felt more confident and slightly more sort of invincible that I could do it. I do remember physically just feeling totally and utterly exhausted. And I think that for me is the overriding feeling of that first year. And having been quite a sort of doing person, kind of waking up early and getting stuff done and looking after the kids, and busy mother of 4, and just waking up and thinking, I can't even have a shower and make myself breakfast, and feeling kind of berating myself for just not being able to achieve anything. And my best friend Vicky saying, talk to yourself like you're your best friend. You wouldn't say to your best friend, God, you're rubbish, you haven't even had a shower this morning, or breakfast, look at the state of you. You'd say, amazing, you've kind of...
Depends on the state of her, of course.
But,
you might, but anyway.
I was looking pretty bad,
yeah.
actually. I remember one point Kit saying, Mummy, why do you look like the ugly man? I'd kind of lost about 2 stone, and I remember going to Boots and putting some blusher on and going, how does Mummy look now, darling? Don't look any better, But no, it's totally exhausting, and I think you have to realise that you cannot expect too much for yourself, because it is all encompassing. It's your mind goes, your memory goes. It's an incredibly physical emotion that you're experiencing.
And invisible.
And invisible. And we've talked about this before, of people kind of saying, well, I saw Victoria today and she looked fine. She's obviously
doing well.
Brilliantly, and she's, really, moving forward. And actually they have no idea that I might have woken up having a horrendous dream about Nico or Emily. But because you look the same, it's very difficult to sympathise almost, isn't it?
Presumably one of the things you hear is people feeling guilty if they ever have a normal thought or moment. That's presumably a battle all of its own in the first. And I wanted to ask you too, how similar are the passages through grief? Presumably every single person, it's a different journey, but how similar are they?
I mean, the thing that's very familiar is guilt. And in a way it's a battle between people's head and their heart. So their head they probably know it wasn't their fault, and whether this was a pre-bereavement that their partner died of cancer or whether it was a sudden death. So their head kind of knows it, but their heart very rarely feels it. And so there's often a hidden kind of serious slogging battle going between people's head and their heart. But also there's a feeling that if I really love this person that's died, I need to show them that I love them. So I really need to show the level of the pain that I'm feeling. So if I let them see or know when I'm happy, I'm somehow abandoning them, or because pain keeps the person close that's died. So if I'm happy and in a way they're sort of further away from me in my kind of present consciousness, then they'll feel abandoned and they'll feel that I've left them. And that takes a long process to realize that actually we can love people without thinking about them all the time. So I spoke to someone this morning and she was saying how guilty she felt, and we kind of had a conversation where she could say that when I go out to work, I can put it kind of further back in my consciousness, and I can consciously do it, and I can do it knowing that I can kind of call on her again. And I think that helps with the guilt, but the guilt is inevitably there.
You've both talked a little bit about the early stages. Can I just ask you for a moment to focus on a sort of year in both general and specific terms, or maybe 2 years in? How did the passage of time change things? Because obviously, grief, you're still feeling grief today, I'm sure, but it's probably forever in its own way.
Yeah.
How does that change over time, and how should people deal with it?
I love the analogy that someone told me about at the beginning. If you think of grief as like a tennis ball and you're putting it into a jar where it fills the entire jar, but actually over time you move it into a kind of bigger bell jar. So the actual grief and the pain, it stays the same size, but your life is expanded around it. So you have moved on, not in terms of the way that you miss them or you love them, you don't miss them or love them any less, but you are busier, you're social, you're meeting people, you're working, you're dealing with your children. Your life does move on. It builds around it, and they're always going to be a massive part of my life. But my life, inevitably gets fuller and busier, and we learn to have them always in our hearts, but without them physically here.
And I think it is, you asked me before, which I didn't answer, about what's unique. I think what will determine how people feel after the first year is their psychological makeup. You were born quite robust. you have a natural kind of fighting spirit. So if somebody is more vulnerable, if someone's had many more losses before, they have more fault lines already in their system, their capacity to manage the loss and navigate those hits is much harder. And also they may be much more self-critical. So the more someone is able to be self-compassionate, the more someone has friends of people that love them, are close to them, that don't kind of expect them to get on with it after a few months, then in a way they fare better. But those that are more fragile, it takes much longer. And the circumstances will have a big difference. So something like Grenfell Tower, for instance, where there'll be the suddenness of it, but also the court case, there's going to be a lot of inquiries, or Hillsborough, people held on to those stories for decades because there was still so many questions. So the more questions there are to be answered that they don't know answers to, the much harder it is to reinvest in your life again.
Is what you, sorry to interrupt, is what you might call righteous anger, an injustice has been done. When you talk to people in that circumstance, people who feel an injustice has been done, is that helpful or unhelpful in dealing with their own grief?
Well, it's completely legitimate, and I don't know if it's unhelpful or helpful, but it burns like a kind of fire in someone, which uses up the psychic energy that would be not better engaged, which means that they don't invest it in their present life. So that we only have so much energy, and if you're using 70% of it, because you still are going over and over these questions that aren't answered, and you're furious with the police for not telling the truth, or whatever's happening with Grenfell Tower, that diverts you really being able to think about loving again, living again. And so that really adds complexity. So there are many layers of complexity to people's grief.
It seems to me that actually two quite separate things go on in grief. One is loss, but the other, depending on who's died and when, is to some extent an imitation of one's own mortality. And certainly in my own experience with my parents dying, as I say, it's a kind of normal experience for everyone that their parents die. But I'm 50. My mother was 65 when she first got cancer.
That's young now.
Yeah,
65. But
you do a bit of a calculation in your head, and I ended up concluding for myself that I wasn't going to be able to enjoy living anymore unless I could at least partially come to terms with dying. So I'm just interested to know whether, Victoria, I don't know, perhaps you didn't have the headspace or energy to even think about it in these terms because you had a family too. When you think of grief in those terms, does that make any sense? And do you ever think about it in those terms or no?
I do worry. My second daughter was incredibly worried about my mortality because obviously once you've lost one parent, then you think the other parent could go at any moment. And she used to literally call me about 30 times on the phone. And that did obviously make me very aware of my own mortality. But I also know that, I know better than anybody that no one knows what's around the corner, right? And we can't spend our whole life worrying that something dreadful is going to happen to us. But I would be very honest and open with her, and I've definitely written down who's going to look after them if anything happens, because I'm their only surviving parent. So we do talk about it, and we're very open. We have very open discussions about what would happen. They all know who they would go and live with, what would happen, which sounds quite depressing, but I think it gives them actually almost quite a lot of comfort, sort of actually knowing what would happen, because as they know, it could happen. And I could say to them, I'm 99.9% sure the worst thing that will ever happen in your life has happened, but I don't know, and they need to have that comfort, that security blanket of knowing that they will be sort of sorted.
Do you, when you talk to people going through grief, is it a recurring theme? How much of it is people at the back of their minds thinking about their own mortality, and how much of it is it about sadness and loss?
I think it's true. Funny enough, after all these years, I haven't really thought about it in the way that you said it, and so it's a different lens to look at it. But I think, yes, you can't not know that you can die once you know someone you love has died, and so I think it is a real wake-up call. And certainly if you're older and it's your partner dying, I often think older people's grief, because their partner's expected to die, is very unrecognised. But that's an enormous grief if you've been married for 50 years. So I think it is, and I think it removes another layer of protection of this sense of our immortality.
I think I've almost gone the other way though and thought, well, Nico and Emily don't have it. Time's become quite a huge thing for me because they suddenly had their time taken away from them. You know, Nico died at 51, Emily died at 8. You know, that's 8 years on this planet, and he had 50 years on this planet. No more time. You know, and I have time, and the children have time. So we are determined that they can't have it, and we have to make the most of our time, almost for them.
So how much has that changed your philosophy of life day to day, your psychology, and in what ways?
Hugely. I mean, I definitely would say, you know, it is about living life to the full and living in the moment. And I remember getting home from hospital and being wheeled down my ramps into my garden and actually smelling my roses. You know, it sounds ridiculous, but we're all so busy, and I was so guilty of it as well. I'd angst about missing a swimming lesson because we were running late, or, you know, everything was kind of a bit of a drama. And I'm not like that at all now. I'm so much calmer as a person because I just want to enjoy the time that I have left on this earth.
Every parent has anxieties about their children, don't they? We all have anxieties about people we love. Do you find that's less than it would otherwise have been because something so terrible has happened and you've survived?
Funnily enough, I'm not more anxious about them. I'm less anxious. I'm there. I give them boundaries for them to bounce between, quite strict boundaries. But we are an incredible close unit, and we talk a lot. We're very open with our emotions. I think that's been incredibly important for all of them, because they all said to me, you know, why do I want to talk to a complete stranger about my innermost emotions? They haven't necessarily wanted to speak to a grief counsellor. I remember you saying, actually, as long as they've got loving and supportive adults that they're close to, that they can talk to, then sometimes that's all they need. And, you know, it might be that when they have children, they want to see somebody going forward. But I guess I don't sweat the small stuff anymore. I just don't let things...
It does change your perspective, doesn't it?
I mean, it makes me quite a hard parent because someone will go, oh, I've got really bad tummy ache. And I'm like, really? I've got one
Not necessarily a bad parent.
Yeah, exactly.
But people do talk about post-traumatic growth, you know, that kind of idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which is a really annoying expression, but also has truth in it, is that people I find who have found ways of living and loving again like you have, their perception about what matters really changes. So it isn't so much about what they look like or making money or how big their house is. It's much more about having meaning, being with people that you love, and they do feel calmer because they feel like they've survived the worst thing that's ever happened to them.
Well, it almost simplifies your life in a little bit because it really makes you think, what makes me happy? You know, with my friends, do I look forward to seeing them? Do I have a good time when I'm with them? And do they make me feel good after I've seen them?
So you've shed a few friends in this
process.
process.
Loads of friends have just gone.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're out. You don't make the cut anymore. Yeah. But no, it almost in a way it simplifies things. It really is very clarifying. All those people that you think was a bit of a duty call, so I don't have time anymore. I'm living my life.
Time's precious, isn't it? It makes you realise how
Do you think men and women deal with grief differently?
I do think that, I mean, there's a long answer and a short answer. I think men are primed, and I think they're actually wired differently to women. I think if you could look inside anyone, which I wish we could with psychological things, men and women feel the same level of pain. But I think men are wired to get on and fix things and do things. And I think women are much more wired to ruminate and go over the grief and remember. And I think they tend to, as a couple, they often pull apart because he comes home and sees her kind of crying and slightly dreads it and thinks she's a wet rag, and he thinks he's a sort of selfish, tough bastard. Why isn't he crying and doing what he should be doing? But actually he has often been crying in the car on the way home, but hasn't cried in front of her because he doesn't want to upset her. And I think one of the big things that happens in families is co-protection. So, I mean, I think we need a stiff upper lip to get on with life, to go to the shops, to go to work. But I think often what happens in families is that we have a stiff upper lip with the people closest to us that we love most. And where there's these layers of protection of not wanting to upset each other, I think there are huge fault lines of understanding that can happen in that family system that are really damaging. And that's particularly true, as we talked about earlier, with children.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they do, and they mirror your emotions. And so if you're not crying, they'll think, well, why is mummy not sad that daddy has died? You know, they take their lead from you with the emotions. And children don't like being sad, you know, so it is, they jump in and out, don't they, of the puddles, that's what they call it. They're kind of jumping on the trampoline 1 minute, and then the next minute they're crying, and then, oh, there's my friend, I'm just going to run off and play with them. And it's quite bizarre to see their path of grief.
Did they respond, because you've got a son and daughter remaining, haven't you? Did they respond differently at all?
Well, they were very different ages, because Kit was only 4, and the girls were, 12 and 11. But yes, I would say going forward, actually, interestingly, the girls have sort of it's harder for them to talk about it in a way, because they're busy teenagers and they're at school, and I think school's been a great thing because they're busy and they can still be children and have their childhood. Kit, I think, is slightly more sort of sensitive about it and does talk about it a little bit more often. But
so in a way, they're the reverse of what I was saying.
Yeah.
Just to add one more thing about men, I mean, statistically, when a partner dies, one of the things people say is that a husband replaces and a woman mourns. And statistically, men are 60% more likely to be remarried within a year, whereas it takes women 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
But it's interesting that Kit and the girls, in a way, he was more sensitive and they were more like, I'm going to be okay, I want to be a normal child. And I think that's to do with being a teenager.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Are you able to draw a clear distinction between the way the 3 of them responded to the loss of their father and responded to the loss of their sibling? Or is it the same tragedy in their heads, which...
I think obviously they're 2 very different losses. I don't think I can draw a clear distinction between them, actually. I think we talk about them equally. We very much kind of sit together and talk about, and actually this is where Julia was very helpful with planning and preparation, because I remember Emily's birthday was August the 19th, 3 months after the accident, and I had no plans. I just woke up and just cried all day, just didn't even come out of my room. And actually I remember talking to you and just saying, you can't just let these days come up and not have any plan, because it will just be totally horrendous. So we did kind of sit down and chatter between the 4 of us about what should we do on that day. Should we make her favourite Cadbury's birthday cake? Should we still buy her favourite ugly toy? And actually then it made it a very family experience. Of course there were tears, but then there was also a bit of laughter, and we'd get out her stupid pom-pom hat, and it was a way of feeling that she was with us that day, and the same with Nico's birthday as well. And I think that planning is so important, and remembering them, and we still do. You know, we go to our favourite kind of Chinese and read out the fortune cookies and talk about Daddy being silly, and it's really important, because just because they're gone doesn't mean that your relationship with them is over, does it?
No, when the person dies, love doesn't die, and I think that's the big difference between generations. I mean, my parents' generation, who kind of fought in the First World War and survivors, were brought up by survivors of the First World War, were very much forget and move on. Don't think about it, don't talk about it, and what you talk about is going to hurt you, you know, so that you just mustn't talk about it. And I think really we know from research, but also from how we are as human beings, that it is by remembering that we heal. It's by talking and remembering that they continue to live in us, and that's an incredibly important part, and how you've managed to kind of rebuild your life.
I'd like to open up to questions in just a minute if I can, but before I get there, one of the things you do brilliantly in your book is you divide between different types of loss. It seemed to me, reading it, though, that there was a lot of commonality. As somebody who's advised people in all these different situations, I mean, obviously Victoria's experience is at the most shocking and tragic and difficult to deal with end. And I guess you would say that losing your parents, which is the natural order of things, is at the other end of the spectrum. But how much commonality in terms of the advice you can give and how you can make people feel positive is there?
I mean, I think there are unique elements. So I think particularly for like when a sibling dies, often siblings are called the hidden mourners, because it's the parents that are often given the attention. And so whether the siblings are children or whether they're adults, I think they deserve much more attention, because the person that's died is the person that they've known all their life, that knew them best, that they have a shared history and shared memories. And so when that sibling dies, all that history dies with them. And so I think sibling death is often very unrecognised. And obviously a child dying, you know, that people think about it, there isn't a hierarchy of grief, but a child dying is a death out of time, and it's the death of your future, like we talked about. So that kind of completely turns your life upside down.
Actually, interestingly, when you said, is there a difference? Like you're thinking, of course, every year with Emily, you can't help but think she would be 12, she would be and you're not going to do that with Nico, because he's in his 50s, and he had an amazing life. Okay, it was still cut too short, but he still had an amazing life.
And he'd have been really annoyed that he was 55, or
yeah,
whatever it
exactly.
is, you know.
Yeah, he was fine.
I'm not having a bad day.
Whereas for her, you can't help but every year think she should be doing this. And you see their friends on the common, and she should have been starting school the year after Olivia. And so there's all these things that her path was sort of set and she's not doing.
Do you think that's also true for her siblings?
Definitely.
That goes through their head?
Definitely. You know, there's a lot of that, and I remember her best friends were starting the school that she was meant to be starting, and you know, we all found that incredibly tough, and of course the poor girl found it incredibly tough because Emily was meant to be there living that journey for them. So, but you know, Amber's amazing. So my elder says Emily was too young to see the world, so she's going to see it through my eyes and with me. She takes a photo of her in her bag and her little purse whenever she goes on a school trip. So she says she's seen Italy, she's seen Rome, she's seen Venice, and she's going to live her life. When I go travelling, she's going to come with me, and you know, Olivia carries her little swatch around with her. You know, they live on through the girls and Kit.
Well, there's a lot of experience in this room, I'm aware of that, so is anyone can quite happily keep talking, so does anyone have a question they would like to ask at this point? Yes, Adam.
I have a question for Julia. You've just started to talk... question for Julia. You've just started to touch on coping strategies. Could you talk some more about coping strategies?
I think the first thing to kind of recognise is that you don't have control of this. You know, people often want to kind of make it tidy, like I said with the nap. So I think it's sort of recognising that pain is the agent of change. So the most important strategy is actively doing things that support you. And that so one of the things that I always talk about is exercise, because grief is embodied, because grief feels like fear. Your body is often in fight or flight. It's often on alert, and so it feels very kind of heightened, and it's very difficult to process information or to feel anything. And exercise is a natural way of telling your body that you've flown. So if you take exercise, you often feel calmer. It drops the cortisol levels in your body and gives you dopamine that kind of calms you down. And so I suggest to people they do a combination of sort of actions, which is taking exercise 20 minutes a day or more, ideally. Doing something that also is like a meditation or a focus or a breathing that calms their system down. And also journaling. So maybe often writing letters to the person that's died, or just kind of finding a narrative by putting words and feelings together and either voicing them to friends or writing them in a journal helps you incrementally adjust. And actually a journal is really good because you can look back and see how you feel differently, because often you feel like, oh my God, I feel like it happened yesterday. But then you can look back 9 months later and see that you actually felt very different. I think the other thing is to recognize that you're not in control, that you're not in charge of it, but also to have some kind of structure. So in my book I talk about the 8 pillars of strength, and having a little bit of structure in your day helps, that you put time aside to exercise and reflect and think about the person that's died, but also structure something that feels supportive. So it may be doing work, something that gives you a break from the pain, that kind of distracts you. Maybe seeing a friend, it may be going out and seeing a movie, so that you have this oscillation between time to grieve and time to have a break from grief. And at the beginning, it's so intense, you can't always have a break. But actually, if you develop a kind of good system, that does naturally happen. The other big thing, which I think is unbelievably cruel of our systems, is that often in grief we're very, very self-critical. And so the pain and anger that we feel, that in a way existentially we don't know what to do with, we often turn it against ourselves. And there's this kind of shitty committee in our head of a kind of berating ourselves. And so one of the big things I talked to Victoria about too was self-compassion, like being aware of what's going on in your head, but also being aware of being kind, be your best friend internally, so that you don't keep criticizing yourself.
And you saying, what was very helpful coming to see you is you would tell me how well I was doing, because I didn't feel that I was moving forward at all, and I was doing exactly the same as kind of a month or 2 months before. So writing that journal is so important, because you do look back and you go, oh wow, I was so low there and so down. And that was incredibly helpful for me when I came to have my sessions with you, and you say, gosh, you've progressed since a couple of months ago, because you don't realise that you are.
Yes, sir.
I would like to ask if one's nationality plays any part in the manner in which you grieve. I come from an Irish Catholic and a British Anglican background, and I had a series of losses last year, and I found, frankly, the process of grieving in Ireland distinctly different to grieving here in the rest of the United Kingdom. And I would just like to sort of explore that part a bit.
Better or worse, can I ask?
I found in Ireland it was much more a community sense of, it was a celebration of one's life. It was where, I found it very interesting that, for example, the main radio station in the south will broadcast sometime during the day who has died in your local county, and as a result, over a period of 3 or 4 days, literally everyone from the sort of the mayor to the village idiot to the person who put your parents' pills in the pharmacy would just turn up with umpteen sandwiches, and you just had no idea who half these people were. And I found that incredibly important in that process. Whereas in the sense of my British side, I found it was much more, leave them alone.
Don't bother them.
They've had this bad news. Don't
you might upset them.
Yes, and it's best to just let them grieve alone. And I found those two differences, very stark, and that really got me thinking about, well, does that nationality difference impact, with, I'm sure, many of the people you come across? Thank you.
I mean, there are very much cultural, national norms, like Awake in Ireland, where, the body is often in the front room and all the community will come into the room. There'll be quite a lot of drinking and celebrating as well, but it's very much part of life, and the body is present, it's not hidden. And I think people do find that much more supportive. And the sort of English one of, a body being hidden away in a mortuary, you having a cremation, so there's no actual visible sign that a person has died. And this thing of like, don't upset them, don't disturb them, is incredibly isolating. So there are kind of national norms, but there are also very much family norms. So you could have an Irish family who may have a good wake and have a good drink, but actually don't talk to each other and connect with each other. And you could have an English family who have much more open communication and do connect. So you can't kind of predict. I think in a way what's much more important is what happens within your own family system and culture than in the community. Because if you have a family system, you can kind of get the support that you need. But different countries through the world have very different attitudes to grief. The Italians still wear black, and it's very different. But I think the pain is the same.
Can I just ask you, Victoria, because I was reading today your very good blog about giving people advice. One of the things is that a lot of people don't know how to respond. They want to help and they don't. But do you feel in the round, culturally, it could have been different, better or worse? And how do you encourage people to know what they can do?
Well, I suppose the way that I wish that people would just say what happened, and it's not kind of the elephant in the room, and not avoid saying their names
To acknowledge them.
Yeah, because they've just died. It's a huge, huge part of your life. And even now, people kind of seem to avoid saying their name. You just wanted, that they haven't totally gone from your life. They're always going to be present in your life. So I found that very difficult. People were very, obviously, nervy around me. And I couldn't see a huge amount of people because I knew that I had to kind of keep quite strong to look after Kit's legs. So I did say, if you're going to cry, don't come and see me, which I think did probably put quite a few people off. But actually all you want is just a bit of acknowledgement of what has happened and just knowing that people are there for you and to support you. And also just to take something off your to-do list. You know, I found it quite unhelpful when people said, please let me know if there's anything I can do. It's like, well, I don't even know if I'm coming or going at the moment. You know, if you said, please let me take Kit to school, or please let me do your shop.
Some lasagna on your doorstep.
Yes, there's a lot of lasagna on my doorstep. Please let me just do something, then that's hugely helpful because your
brain.
brain.
If you want to say I hate lasagna, stop with the lasagna.
Stop already. My freezer is full of lasagna. Bring me some sushi. No, but actually, you just need people to.
You eat sushi.
You need people to think for you because your brain is so full of grief that you can't compute like you used to. So, but I think.
What's the worst things people said?
I was going to say this is a bit of a specific question, but
I think the worst thing. Do you believe in fate? It happened for a reason. Good things only come to those that are strong enough to cope with them. That's another one. My mother-in-law did say, "Isn't it lovely how Nico has Emily?" But she believes in that whole life after death. So she's, you know, they're on a heaven on a cloud, eating Cadbury's together, which is gorgeous. Unfortunately, I don't believe in that. So they were quite hard.
He's in a better place.
He's in a better place. You've got 3 others.
All
those classic comments that don't help. I do remember someone ducking down the aisle in the supermarket to avoid talking to me. That was quite painful as well.
This is another tricky question, but did people respond about how you thought they would, or were there a lot of surprises?
I mean, most people, I have to say, were great. I mean, the worst kind of person is actually the ones that make it all about them. So there were some awful people that actually turn your grief almost into their grief and start to say how much they're missing Nico and Emily. And then I remember there was one girl that used to kind of drop off green juice every morning on my doorstep, and I'd say, "Thank you so much, that's amazing. Leg still hasn't grown back, but it's delicious." And one morning I was busy, probably taking Kit for his 20th operation. I forgot to text, and she sent me a text saying, "Have I offended you?" I was like, "No, I'm just quite busy." So I think it's the people that feel like they sort of own your grief and want it to be, you know, part of their story. But I would say, in the whole, people have been amazing. I mean, I would not be where I am today without Julia and my support network. They have been absolutely incredible, absolutely incredible.
Any other questions?
Can I be greedy and ask another one?
You certainly can. The microphone over here? Where's the microphone?
And there's one at the back there. And there's here.
I think we can probably hear you if you speak up.
You're talking about finite event, like somebody died. I haven't seen my grandchildren since 2009. My son hasn't seen his children since 2009. I think this is something that one hears about more and more. So it is a bereavement, but it isn't finite.
It's a living loss.
It's a living loss, yes. Can you say something about that?
I mean, a living loss is no less painful. In some ways it's more complicated because in grief you know that your task in a way is to face the reality of the loss, that you have to face the fact that the person that you love has died, they're not coming back. The complexity and the paradox of a living loss is that it feels like somebody else is holding the power and you're trying to kind of fight to get that power back, and you also have this hope. You know, one of the difficulties in grieving is sort of having hope to live again. But if you're having hope for something that you have no power over, you can be sort of slumped into even more despair. So it's very complicated, and also you have massive fights and kind of roller coaster in your head, which you can do with the person that's died if you had a difficult relationship. But if they're alive and they're thwarting you being a grandparent, then it's even more so, I think. So it's very, very complex.
Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to slope out now, so I will leave the floor to Julia and Victoria. It's been an extraordinary pleasure to sit here for me and listen to this. I wanted
to ask you about how people responded to you when your parents died.
Well, I think people were. I mean, I think the thing about parents dying is that it has a sort of order to it. In a way that everything Victoria has been talking about doesn't. People don't know how to respond. People sort of do know how to respond. You know, they say how amazing your parents were and everything else. But they give you a little short shrift, don't they? Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty is, most of the difficulty I found with that was in my own head. I felt like I should be feeling better than I was, and I don't know how many of you in this room have lost your parents, but it's, you know, you're constantly, it is, you know in your every breath that it's not like a tragedy. It's not like, you know, they had a good life, and that's why I sort of think that imitations of your own mortality do come into it. You're kind of like slightly looking at the end of your, you know, I mean, my mother died of cancer very slowly. I felt like I'd walked down into the valley of death, said goodbye to her at the end, and then walked out again, and in a way, it was a good death because I got to say goodbye and I got to say everything I wanted to say to her. I got to thank her and tell her how much I loved her. On the other hand, she didn't want to go, and it was just like that sort of ghastly thing where, you know, you're saying goodbye to someone who doesn't want to go, and all the time you're aware that it's not the tragedy of someone young dying or a partner dying, and I suppose that's what led me to think so much about death as a whole and how we don't think about it very much, and how we spend a lot of time avoiding it. And the more I thought about the history of humanity, the more you realise that so much of it is about death. You know, it's the one that we don't talk about it, it's the one thing that unites us, we're all going to die. And if you think about it, even when it comes down to sort of terrorism and stuff, different attitudes to death have an enormous impact on how people conduct themselves in life. So I suppose it's one of those things that I you know, I think Victoria's story is sort of incredible. It's dramatic, it's tragic, it's incredibly uplifting to hear you talk in a way so movingly and intelligently about everything that happened. It sort of, I guess it probably makes everyone in this room feel that there's a chance they could face the worst and come out the other side. So in that sense, it's a, strange as it is to say, a rather inspiring story. And I think when you're on the, you know, talking about these things on the news every night, yeah, sometimes it's just a bit relentless, but we should spend less time talking about bad news. But to mention one other thing that I was incredibly, my first job in the business was in Northern Ireland a long time ago. I was only in my early 20s, and one of the things when you're sort of very junior, one of your jobs was to go onto the doorsteps of the bereaved. So somebody who that day had, you know, I must have done it every day for months, and it was really strange. I mean, obviously, I would always turn up. I'd be exceptionally polite if they didn't want, you know, I'd knock, I'd ask. If they didn't want to talk, I would go away. And actually, one of the things I always really like about the company I work for is that I've never said anything to them that was a moral question that they didn't say, fine. So if I said, I feel really uncomfortable about being here, I want to go, they're like, well, fine, go. But the thing that really struck me about that was how often people were okay about talking to you, and it really puzzled me for a long time until I realised that in some sense the media turning up was some recognition of the extraordinary, because terrorism had become such a routine thing that it was almost like my loved one died and it's almost just too routine, and at least these guys turn up and it's some sort of indication that it's an extraordinary event. So I suppose over time, you know, I've spent a long time thinking about death and our attitudes to it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah.
I mean, it does. The only piece I'd add is that grief is very, that we need to give ourselves permission. It isn't like mine's ordinary, so I should dismiss it. It's like we really need to give ourselves permission. You know, you really loved your parents, and however much you loved them is the level of the loss when they died. And
everything's relative. You know, people say to me, oh, of course, it's nothing compared to what you've been through, but you're going through a really hard time. Your mum's got Alzheimer's, she's dying. You know, of course, it's not going to be. You know, I'm always going to win. But whatever you're going through is incredibly. No, I know. Whatever you're going through is incredibly painful and incredibly hard. And give yourself the space and the ability to kind of feel those emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the things you asked me how people respond. It just struck me that it's one of those things we just don't talk about amongst ourselves. You know, how often do you ever talk about grief? Or, you know, it's a sort of the elephant in the room half the time that we don't talk about it. And particularly in my business, because it's what we talk about every, you know, goddamn day.
I mean, the thing I've been surprised from my book is, you know, I said in the book that grief is the last taboo and, you know, we don't like talking about it. But actually my experience this last year is the reverse, is that wherever I've been, people have been longing to talk about it. They are hungry to talk about it. And people, like here, we still have got lots of questions and a lot of people show up. So I actually think people really want to. I think people are interested. I think people are curious. I think they don't know how to. But if we can give people a language and permission to, I think they will. I mean, I think the important thing is to talk to your family and friends about it, about how you feel, what your fears are, you know, what you want, what your worries are.
But you asked me the other day, you were saying, you've been in touch.
You need to leave at
I know, well, I forget it, I'm going to be late. It's too interesting to go, but Julia was in touch with me the other day. You'd done this campaign about bereavement and dealing with it, and it was very powerful, and you were asking me about putting it on the news, 1 more minute, and people talking about if they had, I don't know, did you all see it? It was about people talking about if they had 1 more minute with their lost loved one, what would they say? And it was extraordinarily powerful, and we put it quite high up news at 10, largely because in the meeting in the early evening I said, look, this is what's happening in society at the moment. This is the bow wave. People are, and if you think about mental health and the Heads Together campaign, always it has been one of the themes of this year that people are more willing to talk about it. And I think, and you were talking about the wars earlier. I lost one grandfather in the Second World War and a great uncle in the First World War, and I guess almost everyone in this room will find in their family sort of history of loss in the wars. And when I look through my family history, as I'm sure you would all find, it's incredible. You kind of can see that they didn't talk about it. They just didn't talk about it.
They couldn't.
And and
there was too much loss. It was impossible. Everybody had lost a partner, a parent, or a child. We have the luxury now, because although there's a lot of terror, there is much less death. We live to 100, you know, to 100 or 95. Why people, in some ways, don't talk about death so much as they did the Victorians is because we are living longer. You know, medicine works. And on the other hand, we all know we're going to die. So there's this incredible dichotomy.
Do you? Can I ask you one final question? I think.
Your wife is going to kill you, by the way.
Yeah. Never mind. I'll
Not my problem.
One more death. But it's murder. I just want to be clear about that. I didn't mysteriously die in a cab on the way there.
You have about 200 witnesses.
One of the things that, do you think people, this is a very generalized and quite difficult question to ask, but do you think people are more accepting of death when they're old? The individual. I mean, if you die,
one of the things I learned in the book is that how people die is how they live their life. So if they've lived their life with a certain kind of open attitude and the acceptance that they're fundamentally powerless in the face of death and that love is what matters, they do find a way of facing their death. But if they're the opposite of that, then they fight against the day at 98 as they would at, 45. That's quite a good answer, isn't it?
It's a very good answer. I'm going to take that away with you. Well, we are out of time now, so can I thank you very much for coming out on this evening.
There are lots more questions. Do come up to us individually and ask questions if you'd like.
But thank you very much for coming. I've personally found it a fascinating and actually rather inspiring chat, so thank you very much.
Thank you.